Hello, everyone. This is the 130th episode of the Soccer Nostalgia Talk Podcast. As always, this is Sean from Los Angeles and the Soccer Nostalgia blog. Unfortunately, Mr. Paul Whittle from the 1888 letter blog could not make it this time. For this episode, I interview Mr. Jurryt van der Vooren as we discuss the Dutch national team in the Olympic tournaments of the 1920s. Mr. van der Vooren is a Dutch professional sports historian. He has written many books and articles on Dutch sports history. Welcome, Jurryt.
Thanks. It's a pleasure to be here.
Can you introduce yourself and your trajectory as a sports historian?
I live in Amsterdam and since 1996, so it's almost 30 years, I'm a sports historian and I have my own website it's sportgeschiedenis.nl, which means sports history, and then in the Netherlands. And well, almost every day I have some articles about the history of sports. And of course, now I want to write about the World Cup or Tour de France or something which bothers me personally. And that's how I do my job for every day, doing research about history of sports and mainly the political history of sports.
Let's go back in time, almost 100 years ago. What was the state and the level of football in the Netherlands domestically and at international level in this post-World War One era?
Well, after the Great War, football became more and more popular in the Netherlands. And you can even say there was a kind of revolution going on inside Dutch football before the Great War started. It was mainly played by young people at the highest level, the elite. And their fathers, they were all rich and famous. And after the Great War, then there was a shift going on, and more people of other classes, middle class, lower class, became interested in playing football. And that's the moment football in the Netherlands became a national sport. And before it was mainly a sport played by the highest classes. At the international level, well, it was hardly playing an important role. There were no big tournaments on only the Olympic Games. And the Netherlands, they won 2 or 3 times the bronze medal. But it wasn't a big tournament like it is now for World Cup football or whatever. And all the players, they were non-professional. It was forbidden in Dutch sports, in Dutch football, to earn money as a professional player. If you did, then you would be banned from football for the rest of your life.
I imagine newspapers would have been the only outlet for information on the game. Would you know about the state of how the sport was covered?
The national newspapers, as you said, they were the most important source for people who wanted to know everything about what happened last weekend. And also magazines made by the sports organization themselves. For example, in 1907, the first national magazine with photos started in Dutch, Revue der Sporten, but it was, if you are reading it, also only for people in the highest classes. If you see the advertisements by buying cars or horses, all very expensive things. But in 1923, for the first time on national radio, which was very young in 1923, only 4 or 5 years old maybe, the results of the matches in football at highest level, they were told at national radio for the first time. And then they started to do it every week on Sunday at 5 o'clock. So only 1 or 2 hours after the match. So everybody in the Netherlands, they know at that moment of that, a possibility to know what happened on that day. Only the results, not what happened in the matches themselves. They had to wait until the next day. Wait.
As the Dutch entered the 1920 Olympics at Antwerp in Belgium, was most of the interest on the track and field events, or did football already attract the interest of the Dutch public?
Football was, yes, it was the most important thing. And there was a lot of stuff going on the Olympics. There were fights in between the National Football Union KNVB and the players because it was very boring in the city. There were no good places to sleep, so the players they were only 20, 25 years old, so they started to drink a lot and organizing parties like we still do, I think, 100 years later. But it was a main subject in the national news, in sports, of course. And also for the first time, when after the war, the Dutch sportsmen they went to Belgium, which was of course very close to the Netherlands. It was by train maybe 1 hour, and there was a lot of attention for the Olympic Games at the sports editions in newspapers, but mainly the football results they were discussed.
In these 1920 Olympics that you mentioned, there was a player mutiny. That was mainly because of the accommodations, whereas the officials were housed in a good hotel and the players were actually lodged in a Dutch Navy ship named Hollandia. Is that true?
Yes, it is. It is right after the Great War, and the circumstances in Antwerpen, like we say in Dutch, they were very bad. Very short after the war, Antwerp, the city of Antwerp, was destroyed by the Germans during the war. And the organization of the Olympic Games, it only took, I guess, 5 months. So that was not very much. And it's a little bit comparable in 1948 in the city of London when the Olympic Games were held. It was 3 years after the Second World War, and also London was damaged by the war. And it was like it was a little bit the same in Belgium, but the damage was even bigger when the Olympics were held in 1920. And the players, the football players, they were located in a very dark ship, nothing to do. Nobody bothered about them only playing the match, and then you have to do whatever you like, but we are not bothering. And the officials, the members of the football association, they took the good hotels, which also happened with the swimming. The swimmers, they sometimes they had to sleep in the bath in a hotel, and the officials they had a good bath, then so a good they could sleep very well, and that's one we think one of the reasons why the Dutch football players they started a revolt against the KNVB.
The ringleaders appear to have been Jan de Natris and Harry Dennis. What can you tell about the life and the career trajectory of the protagonists, like the players that I mentioned, also others like the team captain, Leo Boschart, Bear Grosjean, among others?
Leo Bossart, he was the captain. And the other players like Jan de Natris, he was one of the most famous players in the Netherlands at that time. He was playing for Ajax Amsterdam. And in 1918, they won their first national championship, their first title. And Jan de Natris, he was one of the players of that team. They went all to Belgium. And as I already told, all those players, most of those players, they were from the highest classes. They were not workers, that was not middle class. So there were not players from the lowest classes playing in that national team of 1920. And in the Netherlands, there were famous players, but outside, nobody knew about them because it's only just a couple of years after the Great War. So international sport was just restarting after 6 years.
In these Olympics, the Dutch reached the semifinals where they lost to Belgium. During the gap between 1920 and 1924, had the game and the interest grown in an observable way domestically or at international level?
Yes, because after the war, international sports, especially Olympics, there was no World Cup football then. It started in 1930. And that means international football at the Olympic level was most important at that moment. But FIFA, they had very big problems in those years. There was no money, there was no capacity to organize international events. And it was saved by a Dutchman, Hirschman, who was a banker in daily life. And he was doing all the organization for FIFA. And during the 20s, he saved the organization. Maybe there was no FIFA anymore if Hirschman had not involved and saved the organization. And that's also why the FIFA went to the city of Amsterdam to have his headquarters over there. Now it's in Switzerland. But in 1928, the headquarters of FIFA were in the center of Amsterdam because of Hirschman. And that's also the place where they started to organize the first World Cup, 1930. It was done in Amsterdam. At an organizational level, Amsterdam became the center of international football because of Hirschman. But that's something different than the players themselves, because the Netherlands, it was the team was okay, but it was not a big team because then Uruguay started to control, to rule the waves. 1924, winning their first gold medal at the Olympic Games, doing it again in 1928 in Amsterdam. That's when it started. Football also became popular outside Europe. But as an organization level, Amsterdam, it was the center of the world.
As the Dutch entered the 1924 Olympics in France, was the team better prepared on and off the field? And as it also included some remnants of the 1920 team that their names we mentioned a little earlier.
Well, the team of 1920, they were all kicked out of the national team in the first match after the Olympic Games. So 11 new players started the match after their last match in Belgium at the Olympic Games against Spain because the Football Association was pissed off. So they kicked everyone out. And then a new generation of players, Leo Boschart, he was not playing again anymore. And then you already told the name about Hardy Denis, coming from the city of The Hague. And he was the new captain. There was a new generation of players. And in Paris, they met the Dutch in the beginning, Ireland. The first time Ireland was playing at an international level and independent from the United Kingdom. Finally, they reached the semi-final against Uruguay and they nearly won. But at the end of the match, the referee took a very strange decision to give Uruguay a penalty. And nobody understood why he did. But Uruguay, they didn't care why. But they just like the Dutch, if would happen, they would do the same. And Uruguay won because of that penalty and reached the final, winning their first gold medal after that match. And that means the Dutch team was one of the best of the Olympic Games of 1924.
What can you say about life and career trajectory of protagonists from this tournament, such as Jegers van der Meulen, among others?
Gees van der Meulen, he was the keeper playing in Haarlem at HFC. It's the oldest football club we have in the Netherlands, still existing. He was one of the best keepers of his time. And Kees Spel was also a part of the national team, coming from Feyenoord, still existing, Rotterdam. And he was a worker, so he was not of high class background. And that caused a lot of problems inside the team because when he was in Paris to play his first match, the other players of the national team, they didn't want to meet him, to talk with him, because he was not like them. He was not high class, and they didn't trust him just because he was a worker in daily life. And then Pell said, okay, well, then I'm going. I'm leaving because I don't want you to behave like this. I don't want to be a part of your organization if you think I'm not as good as you because I'm only a worker. And he left and then went to the station to go home to Rotterdam. And then the other players were forced by the National Association, Football Association, to apologize. And they did, and Pell returned. And in the next match, he made 4 goals. And he was the best player of Europe at the tournament in Paris. But they didn't accept him because he was not at the same social level as the other players. And that was a lot of friction. And maybe because of Pel, he started also a social revolution inside the national team, becoming more and more a team which represented the whole of the Netherlands and not only the higher classes.
The goalkeeper Van der Meulen would be a controversial figure during World War II. Can you talk about that phase of his life?
Van der Meulen became a member of the Dutch National Socialist Party, NSB, Nationaal Socialistische Beweging, National Socialist Movement. And he was not only a member, but was also he was working for the Germans, and he also was a doctor at the front at the war in the East. So he chose the Nazi side. After the war, he was punished for doing that. He had to go to prison for a couple of years. Dutch football never accepted him anymore because he had chosen the side of the Germans, the Nazis. And there are some players, some sportsmen in the war still famous in Dutch history, not for a good reason, but because they became Nazis during the Second World War. The other one is Tinus Oostendorp, winner of 2 bronze medals at the 1936 Olympics after Jesse Owens. He also was punished after the war, or the boxer Sam Olij. He also was in the beginning sentenced to death. After a couple of years, he was released. And they are the people who know something about the history of sports during the Second World War. They know names like Geus van der Meulen, Tinus Oostendorp, Sam Olij. They were the bad guys.
After such an impressive showing in these Olympics, was there a bump in interest of football domestically between 1924 and 1928?
Yeah, 1928, it was the next tournament. And as I already told, there was no World Cup in the 20s. And that's why the Olympics, it was the most important football tournament there was in the world. And already Uruguay showed in Paris in 1924 they were the best, so everyone was expecting something special in 1928. Brazil was also intended to come, but at the last moment they were not going to Amsterdam, the Brazil national football team. Uruguay again reached the final, winning. And in the Netherlands, everybody was, of course, hoping the Netherlands, the national team, would also at least reach the final. But they made a big mistake by organizing the 1928 football tournament, and that was to organize a knockout system from the first match, starting at the first match. And the Netherlands, they had a very bad luck because the first match was against Uruguay. And they lost. In the first match, the home team of the 1928 Olympics was sent home. It was very bad, of course, for the organization because less people in the Netherlands wanted to buy a ticket to come to see a match because the Dutch team was already gone. And then they started a second tournament, a losers tournament, including the Netherlands, Belgium, and Chile, because Chile came by boat to Amsterdam, a travel, I guess, for maybe a month to reach Amsterdam, only playing one match before the Olympics started. They had to play a qualification match against Portugal, and they lost. So they went to the Olympics. They never joined. That's the reason why the Dutch said, okay, we will organize a second Olympic tournament, a losers tournament. And then in the final, it was the Netherlands against Chile, and the Netherlands won. And then the Netherlands said, well, you came so far to not qualify the Olympics and losing the final. Here, you can have our prize and have a good trip back. The final, there were two of them because it was the first one was not decided after 19 minutes, and then there was no system of having penalties at the end to make a decision. So the final was played twice, and the people from Amsterdam, they loved, really loved it, because the best football players of the world coming from South America, they were playing in Amsterdam. There was no film in 1928, so you never were able to see all those players of South America in your own city. And then there were two finals. And both finals, the stadium was filled with people, mostly from Amsterdam, to watch the best football players in the world for once in a lifetime.
Yeah, and those same two teams 2 years later would play in the final of the inaugural World Cup,
And then it was in 1930. Yes, it was.
Uruguay and Argentina. The Dutch, as you mentioned, they played their only match against Uruguay apart from the consolation round. Can you discuss all the controversy and the stories regarding this match?
It started by choosing the countries for the match. And the Dutch Prince Hendrik, he was married with the Queen Wilhelmina, he was responsible for doing that. And then when he was combining the Netherlands and Uruguay, everybody in the room became silent. They were shocked. The first match against the Olympic champion, it was the worst thing possible. And then the prince asked, "Did I do anything wrong?" He didn't, but it was just bad luck. Then the pre-sale started for people to buy tickets. And of course, everybody wanted to buy a ticket. But the organization, the Dutch Olympic Committee, they made a very big mistake by having only one place where it was able to buy tickets, and it was in the center of Amsterdam. It meant all the people who wanted to buy a ticket had to come to that only place. Thousands and thousands of people, they gathered already 24 hours before the pre-sale started inside the center of Amsterdam. And more and more people were gathering. So at least 10,000, maybe 20,000, 30,000 people were gathered in the city of Amsterdam during the night before the pre-sale started, very close to the place where all the sailormen were drinking a lot of beer in the night. Rembrandtplein, Rembrandt Square. It's just 100 meters away. And when they closed the pubs at 2 or 2 o'clock in the night, all those sailormen, they saw the people waiting there. They started to fight because they were drunk. So a lot of fights started in the night before the pre-sale started. And then the moment when I think it was 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock in the morning, something like that, the pre-sale started, there were a lot of fights in the center of Amsterdam because there were also people who didn't want to wait. They tried to buy a ticket immediately. So everybody who was waiting for 24 hours, and then more and more fights started. So there were all riots in the center of Amsterdam. When the pre-sale started, I think maybe 2 or 3 minutes after, and all the tickets were sold, and then the Amsterdam police, they were really, really angry about what happened, and they wrote a letter. They organized a meeting with Dutch Olympic Committee to do something never, never, never again. And it was very strange because all the matches of the national football team, people wanted to see, wanted to buy tickets. So the football association, they knew you need a lot of places where you can buy tickets in pre-sale, not only one. So also in the city of Groningen and in the south in Maastricht and in Rotterdam, maybe 10, 20, 30 places where you can buy tickets, but not only one in the center of Amsterdam. And then Dutch Olympic Committee, well, they were forced to apologize for what happened. And it became famous in the Netherlands as the Nacht van Uruguay, the night of Uruguay, the night when Amsterdam was fighting to buy a ticket to see the football match against Uruguay.
There was controversy during the match itself, as there was some bad blood stemming from the 1924 match. And it was believed that Harry Denny and Vander Meulen had tried to incite their teammates as they believed that Uruguay would play a rough physical match. There was an incident where apparently Harry Denis refused to shake hands with the Uruguay captain Jose Nasazi. There's another incident where Pierre Massy was fouled by Uruguayan. The Uruguayan tried to shake hands and help him get up, but Harry Denis shouted that don't take his hand or something to that effect. These incidents did not make the Dutch look good for the organizers nor the public.
There were, as you said, a lot of emotions during and after the match, and Hardy Denis, the captain, there was indeed a discussion also after the match if it was fair what he was doing. But I guess most people they were disappointed only after one match. The Netherlands was not playing the tournament anymore. I think there's also a difference between it was the first time the Dutch people were looking at South American football in a Dutch stadium. And of course, they were playing with another attitude than we were used in 1928 in the Netherlands. It was completely different. That's the nice thing about international football. All those different styles are coming together. But mainly, the Dutch were disappointed it was over after one match. And Uruguay, the next match they are playing was against Germany. That was also a match which made a lot of impression in Amsterdam, not because of the match itself, but because a lot of German people, for the first time after the Great War, were coming by train to the city of Amsterdam. Thousands and thousands of Germans came only for one day to the city of Amsterdam to see the match. So they all came by train to the central station and then made a walk to the Olympic Stadium, watching the match, and went at home immediately after the match. So all the people renting hotel rooms, they were very disappointed because they thought, well, a lot of Germans, they can rent rooms, they can spend their money in the city of Amsterdam, but they left immediately. Uruguay was winning again. And also, it was a clash between European football of the 20s and the new style of South American football. And at the end, the final was not a clash anymore of Europe and South America, but it was only South America, Uruguay and Argentina, and they were playing the final. As I said, there were some discussions after the match about Henrik Denis, but I think most important is disappointment about losing the first match as the national team at the Olympics in Amsterdam.
Harry Denis, he was a captain and he was the common link of all these three tournaments in his 1920s, as he was present in 1920 and 1924 as well. What more can you tell about him and his status in Dutch football?
Well, his name is forgotten in Dutch football history because it's 100 years ago, but he has been one of the most famous players in his time. His son later told when he was doing some on his bike and the police said, we are giving you, you have to pay money. Then they asked his name and he said, I'm Denis. Oh, wait, you are the son of Harry Denis? Yeah, okay, then you can go. Then it's no problem. Denis, he was one of the most famous football players of the 20s, coming from The Hague. Later, after he stopped playing football, he became the president of a Dutch cocaine factory, which at that moment was not illegal. It was even governed by the national state when cocaine was made and produced. And he was one of the biggest dealers, you can say, of cocaine in Dutch history. But it was allowed by law at that time.
Some other names from this 1928 Olympics include the likes of Wim Tap and Pierre Massey. What can it say about their trajectories?
Well, Pierre Massey, he is the first football player in the Netherlands to have his own statute. It was in 1965. He's coming from Limburg in the south of the Netherlands, in between Belgium and Germany, from the city of Roermond. And he was very famous in Limburg, reaching the national team, which the most players were coming from the west of the Netherlands, Amsterdam, Rotterdam, The Hague, the cities in the west of the Netherlands. And very few players from Limburg or the North Groningen were asked to play in the national team. Massy from Roermond, he was. And that's why he was so famous in Roermond in his city. And he not famous at all outside. And in 1965, having his own statute. Now in the Netherlands, you can find statues of a lot of players, maybe 50 statues we have. Of course, Johan Cruyff and a lot of other players. But the first ever, and it's always a nice question for a pub quiz, which Dutch football player was the first ever to have his national statute? Pierre de Massy from Roermond. And last year I was in Roermond for doing something else. And then, of course, I wanted to see it. It's a very small statue standing in the center of Roermond. And I guess most people of Roermond have never seen it. But still, it's the first of the statute in the Netherlands for a football player. And that's why Massy, he is like a symbol of one of the few players reaching the national team, which was mainly coming from the west of the Netherlands, from the big cities. And Jan de Natries, for example, Amsterdam, Harry Denis, The Hague, Gees van der Meulen, Haarlem, all cities in the west. Wim Tap, you also said his name. He was maybe one of the first players in the Netherlands ever to have his own song in the stadium when he was playing a match. I don't know exactly the rhythm, but it was a little bit top, top, trap die ball, top, which means stop. You have to kick the ball, top, please. And all the people in the stadium, when he was playing, then they were singing the song. We think he was the first player ever in the Netherlands to have his own song made by the people who love him.
Comparing the beginning and the end of the decade, had there been an improvement in terms of playing and infrastructure, and had the status of the game changed?
Well, the status of the games was becoming bigger and bigger, and not only because of football itself, but also because of the start of national broadcasting of radio. In 1928, for the first time ever, a match of the Dutch team was broadcasted on national radio, which means a lot of people who never heard about football, they were listening to the radio. And when the Dutch team was playing and the famous Dutch journalist Han Hollander was doing the reports on radio, the police said, we really like it when he's doing that because there is nothing happening on the streets. Everybody's inside. There are no thieves. There is no robbery. We like to have football matches all day, every day, because then it's silence. We don't have to do anything against crime. And a lot of new football clubs started just because they heard on the radio of Han Hollander telling the stories about the national team. And then they say, oh, we also want to start a football team. Because of radio, football became even more popular. And then more and more people wanted to play or to go to the stadium to watch a match. Another thing which was very important during the First and the Second World War for football to become a bigger sport in the Netherlands, the Catholic Church decided to organize their own football competitions because they didn't want the Catholic boys and men to play in a team in which non-Catholics were also playing. In Dutch, we call it verzuiling, living in your own area. Only Catholics organization, Catholics football clubs, Catholic school, Catholic newspapers, just like the socialists did and the liberals. They all had their own organizations living in their own world, the socialist world, the Catholic world. And when the Catholic Church decided to start their own competition, a lot of new football clubs started in the south of the Netherlands, the Catholic area. And in between the First and the Second World War, from every three new clubs, one of them was a Catholic club. And which has been very important for Dutch football, the Catholics were joining. They maybe had 50,000, 100,000 members of the Catholic football organizations, which was, and the National Football Union, they had 300,000 members. It was really, really big. After the Second World War, it became one organization. But before the Second World War, there were all different football organizations, socialist, Catholic, and the liberals, which is now KNVB, still the National Football Association. That's also very important, which means national radio broadcasting have been very important to make the game bigger. And the Catholic clubs, they made the game bigger, especially in the south of the Netherlands. And if you're looking now to the south of the Netherlands, a lot of professional football clubs are coming from a very small area in the south of the Netherlands. And that's all a result of 100 years ago when Catholic Church decided to start their own competitions. Then all the Catholic parents, they were not afraid anymore their son would play in a team where non-Catholic boys would play. And then it was okay.
As far as the newspaper coverage, was there any difference from the beginning of the decade to the end of the decade?
It became bigger and bigger and bigger because already in the beginning of the 20th century, newspapers, they found out if there was a big match and they would write about it and they would have photos on front page. They were selling more advertisements. They were selling more newspapers. And it became more and more acceptable to write about national football and also other sports because of earning money. And when national radio broadcasting is also involving, then it's even more important to join. And because of the radio, the reports in newspapers changed because everybody already had heard on the radio what has happened during the match. So it was not necessary anymore the next day to write a long story about what happened. So they were talking also after the match to football players and writing about more about the life around football. That changed because people on radio already heard what happened during the match. And the newspapers, they didn't have to write about that anymore. So they were changing their attitude about writing about football.
In each of these Olympic Games, the Netherlands were managed by a different English manager. So in 1920, we have Frederick Warburton. In 1924, we have William Townley. And in 1928, we have Robert Glendening. So, how important was this English influence in Dutch football?
It started in 1908 when, or 1907, when the Netherlands were playing a match against England, having a Dutch coach, losing 12-2. It's the biggest defeat ever in Dutch history. And then Dutch newspapers, Football Association, everybody agreed we cannot go on like this. We don't understand what's going on in international football. So we need someone who is coming from the land where football is coming from England. And then the first English coach was coming to the Netherlands. And in 1908, he was responsible for the Olympics in London. And then Netherlands was winning a bronze medal. And that meant the Netherlands, they were becoming better after having an English coach. And so it went on in that period by having English coaches because they were coming from England, where football was already a very big and traditional sport, which was not in the Netherlands at that moment, using their experience by improving Dutch football. And one of the things to improve, and maybe you think it's very strange to tell, but it's just to meet each other before the game starts, to have training together, which before the English coaches were coming, the Dutch people, they never met before a match. Sometimes they would only met each other for the first time a couple of minutes before the match was started. And that changed after 1907, after the big defeat in England, by using English coaches for improving the Dutch football.
In closing, what is the legacy of these Olympic performances in Dutch football history? Did they in any way help in the growth of the game into the next decade?
The Netherlands have been part of three Olympics in the 20s, which have been important because it was the only place to meet other international teams, just from Belgium or Germany, which are very close to the Netherlands, but also to find out what Uruguay is playing, how Uruguay is playing, or Portugal, or even countries from Asia. That was all very new, and I think the Dutch football have learned a lot of it just by playing that matches. How football can have a lot of different styles, not only the Dutch one, but also the South American and Asian and African and South European way of football. And that improved Dutch football, I think, but not to make it a big football country. In the 30s, there was a generation including Beb Bakhuis from the city of Zwolle in the east and also playing in The Hague in the west. He was a very good football player, but it's just like, well, by accident, he was born in the Netherlands and he was a very good football player, just like Johan Cruyff or Marco van Basten. And football itself was improving in the Netherlands, the organization, because it was getting more and more professional to organize competitions, and because the media was covering more and more football. So a lot of people wanted to join a football match. But still, there was no professional football in the Netherlands until 1954. It was forbidden in Dutch football to earn money as a profession. And that didn't improve. Although there have been discussions in the 30s, a lot, started by trade unions and socialist organizations to let the football players earn money because it was during economic recession in the 30s the big crisis. And all those football players, a lot of football players, they had no work in daily life. And every Sunday they were playing in stadiums filled with 10 thousands of people. The football clubs, the football association, the stadiums were earning a lot of money, really a lot of money, and the football players didn't earn nothing at all. And that's why socialist organizations said, well, please, we want to have professional football, not by earning millions of dollars like it is now, but just for those football players, they can have a living. But it only changed in 1954.
With that, I would like to thank you for your participation in this interview. As always, feel free to leave questions and comments. All our respective contact information and the links to Mr. Van der Doorn's books are on the blog and podcast uploads. So, Judith, thank you once again and hope to continue these discussions on Dutch football history.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me.
Thank you.